Okay.
Okay, I'm Charlie Hoy-Ellis is a research scientist with the Goldsen Institute at the University of Washington in Seattle. He has extensive research and teaching experience in diversity and advanced aging practice. Dr. Hoy-Ellis is a licensed independent clinical social worker with expertise in psychotherapy and substance use issues, working with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning individuals, couples, families, groups, and communities. And he's going to talk to us today about creating community among LGBTQIA older adults. Welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit of the work that I do and the work that I'm passionate about. I also want to thank all of my team members here at the Goldsen Institute because this is a collaborative effort. No one of us could do it alone, so I want to be sure to acknowledge everybody. What I'm going to share today is my own perspective and some of my teammates' perspective. It does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institutes of Health or the National Institute on Aging. And the NIH both fund a lot of the research that I'll be talking about today. So we have no commercial relationships to disclose. What I'm going to talk today is describe how LGBTQIA older adults' histories, how historical and social context continue to impact health and healthcare today, and why older LGBTQIA adults may be distrustful of healthcare and government systems. Also be talking about health disparities using the health equity promotion model framework, and I'll go into more detail about that in a bit. And then identify strategies for creating welcoming communities for LGBTQIA older adults. Thank you, Barbara, for reminding us about the 4 M's. I just want to point out really quickly, the only reason I have medication crossed out is because that's outside of my wheelhouse. So I'm not licensed or don't have the education or professional knowledge to prescribe medications, but medications are important. So that's the only reason I have that one X'd out. So what matters with LGBTQIA older adults is person-centered care. And so person-centered care is empowering, but how can we empower individuals if we don't know what some of their greatest fears and misgivings are? How can we honor their choices if we don't recognize their particular family constellations, communities, and things along those lines? How can we promote well-being if we don't understand how systems and structures have really, really kind of what's the word I want to use here? Have actually gotten in the way of promoting well-being. We also want to support independence, and that also means we have to understand older adults' lives, and not just their lives today, but their histories. And so I'll also be talking about the Healthy People 2030 initiative, which is to promote the nation's health, reduce health disparities, and improve the quality of life for everybody. So I don't know if there's any Talking Heads fans out there. When I do presentations like this, I like to weave a little bit of my story into it just to kind of make it more real. So one of the things that I like to talk about is how the heck I got to where I am. So it's me when I'm 7 years old. That was the very first day I got my very first pair of glasses, and you can tell from that image that I'm already studying to be a professor, even though I didn't know it at the time. What you may not know is that by definition, until I was 13 years old, I was considered to have a sociopathic personality disturbance. So I am a gay man. I did not know what that meant until I was 13 or 14. But like many LGBTQIA older adults or people in general, We knew at a very early age that we were different, even though we didn't have the language or the conceptualization for what that difference was. But the first edition of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that was published in 1952, characterized homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. So here's a more sinister image, and what this one is meant to show is that until I was 43 years old, depending on where I lived, I was a statutory felon. So in 2003 in Loving v. Texas, the Supreme Court struck down the last, they're called sodomy laws, but essentially it was a felony to engage in same-sex behavior, even among consenting adults, until 2003. So when I would visit my family in Texas, I was basically a statutory felon. So my master's is in clinical contextual social work. And what that is, I do clinical social work, but it's also important that I account for context. So what are people's social context, cultural context, historical context? From 2003 to 2009, I worked at Seattle Counseling Service for Sexual Minorities, as Barbara indicated during my introduction. And I went into work there having the book learning about things like internalized stigma, things like that. But over the course of my 7 or 8 years there, I began to see in people's real lives how that was actually playing out. So there's this moment that everything that comes after is going to be different from everything that came before. In addition to providing psychotherapy and substance abuse services, I was also the HIV specialist. So a great many of my clients were actually HIV positive. Not all of them, but quite a few of them were. So there was one gentleman I worked with, and it was coming up on his 40th birthday, and he had been diagnosed with HIV several years prior. And so you have to remember that back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the new protease inhibitors that came onto the market were very different than they were today. And you may or may not be familiar with terms like Crick's belly or things like that, but the side effects of the protease inhibitors were so severe that they actually would impact people's physical appearance. So we were in session one day and started talking about, maybe it's time for you to start thinking about taking your HIV medications. And he stated flat out, I'd rather be dead than old. And so the LGBTQIA community, like any other microcosm of society, magnifies and distorts some of the dominant paradigms in society. And so particularly in gay and bisexual male communities, less so in transgender and lesbian and bisexual women's communities, it's still there, but not to the degree that it is in men's communities. When you're 30 years old, you've pretty much hit middle age. And by the time you're 40, you're actually considered over the hill. And so I was seeing how this intersection of ageism and heterosexism was coming together to really negatively influence people's everyday lived experience. And that was when I decided that I needed to go back and get a PhD. So my PhD is in social welfare. And I started looking at the social determinants of health. So seeing how these higher level policies of what I call cultural gravity was actually impacting a lot of the reasons that people were coming to see us at Seattle Counseling Service. So certainly a lot of depression, generalized anxiety disorders, things like that. But a lot of that depression and anxiety was actually driven by legal policies and cultural gravity. So I use the term cultural gravity because culture is, in a sense, like gravity. You cannot observe it directly, but there's no way you can escape its effects every minute of the day. So I finally decided I needed to step back from providing direct services for a little while and figure out who is throwing people into the river to begin with. And so we were trying desperately to pull people out of the river but not really looking at why people are being thrown into the river to begin with. And that's when I really became interested in the social determinants of health. So I'm going to assume that there's at least some recognition of these different terms, and I'm going to switch using terms here for a moment. So really essentially, sexual orientation is who we're attracted to, the direction that we're pulled towards, and gender identity. So gender and sex are typically used interchangeably, but they're actually distinct constructs. So sex is our biology. It's whether our reproductive organs are internal or external or indeterminate. And our gender identity, our gender is what law, politics, culture, and society say we can and cannot do, or should and should not do, based entirely on our biology. So for example, women and girls are expected to be emotional and caring and nurturing, and boys are expected to not cry and suck it up and things like that. So gender is cultural, legal, political. Gender identity is our deepest sense of ourselves as a gendered person in terms of our biology. So I am a cisgender man. I identify as a man. I'm biologically a male. I couldn't tell you how I know that I'm a man, but I know that I am. Someone who is transgender, on the other hand, or non-binary, their deepest sense of themselves as a gendered person may not align very much with their biology. So in 2016, the National Institutes of Health started using the definition of sexual and gender minorities. And in 2019, they updated that. And so SGM, or sexual and gender minorities, includes, but is not limited to, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersexed, asexual, aromantic, or anything like that. It's essentially people who identify outside of the historically understood false binary that we're either male or female, and that our gender and our sex are the same thing. And that's getting a lot of attention here in the world today, and I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Charlie, we're seeing some gray boxes on your slides, and I'm getting some cues that if you click on your share screen arrow and then click on hide floating panels, that might help that.
Okay.
See something like that? Or Zach, if you want to cue on this, just click on your share screen.
Okay.
And then one of the options, if you click on that little arrow to the right of share screen, I think one of the options, but I'll leave it to Zach.
Are you there, Zach?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so can you click on the share screen?
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, so in the top right of your panel with the three dots where it says more, if you want to click on that and just scroll down to hide floating meeting controls.
Okay. Can you see me now?
Yeah, I'm still seeing one gray box. Are you able to hide that box by any chance?
There. Perfect.
Is it okay now?
Yep. Thank you.
Sure,
Sorry,
thank you.
everyone.
Yeah, appreciate the helping hand. I'm a smart guy, but technology is not in my particular wheelhouse. So the genderbread person here is just to kind of push back against this traditional and in error arbitrary binary of either or, and most of us are on a continuum. So I talked a little bit about gender identity. Gender expression is how we socially communicate our gender identity, which again is putatively based on our biological sex. And as I mentioned before, sexual orientation is who we're attracted to sexually, affectionately, emotionally, spiritually, things like that. So really quick case study. So Selena is a transgender woman who's meeting with John, a male nurse, to complete a basic physical exam. John's never engaged in or performed an exam on a transgender person before, finds himself very curious and repeatedly catches himself staring at her. After completing her physical, John says, you know, at first I thought you were a real woman. When do you plan to complete your gender reassignment surgery? To which she angrily responds, and rightfully so, I don't think that has anything to do with the admissions process, and are we done here? So one of the reasons that Selena is upset is because John has implied that she's not a real woman, and by staring at her is actually communicating that somehow Serena is abnormal. And the question about her surgery was not a medical need, it was actually just to satisfy his own curiosity. So we can avoid being overly intrusive by avoiding questions that are not relevant to clinical care. And most importantly, we can be honest. If we don't know, it's okay to say, you know, I don't know. If I say or do something that is offensive, please let me know, and I will absolutely apologize in a very heartfelt way. So this is just one of the ways that we can provide better care. So some of the research findings I'm going to be sharing today are from our basic research unit, the Aging with Pride National Health, Aging, Sexuality, Gender Study. So it's the first of its kind NIA funded longitudinal study of sexual and gender minority adults age 50 and older. We've been following 2,450 adults since 2014. So you can see all of the details here. So this is a quote from one of our participants, and this is actually why we're here today. So isolation, finding friends, support, caregiving, and healthcare are the biggest issues older gay persons face. Who will be there for us? Who will help care for us without judgment? And that's a very important thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of why people would be afraid of judgment, but just to give a little context. So today there are almost 3 million Americans aged 50 and older who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. In many communities, so particularly communities of color, Black, Indigenous, people of color, even though their primary sexual encounters may be with members of the same sex, they do not identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual. So those are sexual orientations, even though they do engage in that. These numbers are expected to double by the year 2060. And so there's a huge sexual gender minority older adult population out there that's going to become even larger in the coming years. Also want to be sure to talk about intersectionality because so I identify as a cisgender gay white man from a working class background, but I'm never any one of those on any given day. I'm at the intersection of all of those. And so what's important about intersectionality in this particular context is on any given day, I don't think about my race as a white person unless I choose to, or unless I'm in a particular context where it becomes very evident. I don't think about my gender as a cisgender man, but there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about my sexual orientation. So intersectionality will become more, the importance of it will become clearer when I get to the health equity promotion model here in just a bit. So Barbara already talked about what matters, and so I'm not going to rehash that. However, what you're seeing here is asking people by race, ethnicity, and gender and sexual orientation, how concerned they are about the quality of care they'll be receiving by healthcare professionals and staff. And you can see here that more than a third pretty much across the board, with the exception of white people, are very concerned or somewhat concerned about the quality of care that they're going to receive in healthcare settings. So this is from the American Association for Retired People. This is not our particular research, but you can see here the overwhelming majority of sexual and gender minority older adults would feel more comfortable with providers who are trying to identify and address their specific needs, who advertise and highlight SGM-friendly services, people who hire LGBTQ plus people, display LGBTQ plus welcoming signs, and over half fear being refused care or services or receiving substandard care. So I always do this when I do a training like this. So I actually went to the Northwest GWEC website and entered LGBT in the search engine box. And you can see here, it came up with nothing. So as a LGBTQ plus person, when I'm potentially looking for a healthcare provider and I look at something like this and I don't see myself represented, that gives me a certain type of information that either I'm not recognized or my sexual orientation or gender identity is not viewed as important. Now, I do want to qualify that because it is clear that this is important to the Northwest Geriatric Workforce Enhancement community. I just want to point this out when I go to the website that there's nothing there. So this is from our research from the NHAS study, National Health, Aging, Sexuality, and Gender Study. 1 in 5 older LGBTQ plus adults do not disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity to their primary care provider. And that has very important implications for the quality of care. The American Medical Association is on record as saying physicians' failure to ask and patients' failure to provide this information can result in substandard care and can actually lead to some pretty bad health outcomes. So this is another quote from one of our study participants. So this person has had a very positive experience with their gender transition so far, but their primary concern about the future is access to healthcare and potential discrimination as an older transgender person, especially if the need arises for emergency or long-term care. So what we see pretty much across the board when we compare lesbian, gay, bisexual older adults to their heterosexual counterparts, there's a lot of health disparities pretty much across the board. When we compare transgender older adults to lesbian, gay, bisexual, non-transgender older adults, we find that transgender older adults pretty much across the board have worse outcomes and experience even more discrimination and barriers to healthcare than do lesbian, gay, bisexual, non-transgender older adults. So many transgender older adults will actually refuse to access healthcare services or put it off until it becomes a dire emergency. And so this is something that we need to be thinking about as healthcare providers. So why would lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, questioning older adults, why would we trust healthcare providers? So this is another really quick case study. So Frank identifies as a gay man. He's a new resident at a skilled nursing facility, and the social services director has a moral objection to same-sex relationships, but no, he has to treat people with dignity and respect. During the evaluation, Scott is polite but not friendly. He avoids eye contact and decides not to ask Frank anything about his relationship or sexual history because it makes him feel uncomfortable. So what Scott doesn't know is that Frank is now fearful about his care and wonders if he's going to be treated fairly. Scott, on the other hand, feels proud of himself for completing the assessment and not saying anything that we considered offensive or judgmental. I'm going to go into this a little bit more here shortly. So standpoint theory says that where your social positioning and social locations are determine the reality that you experience. So some features of reality are prominent and other features of reality are obscured. So I would guess there are very few, or if any of you who are currently participating in this presentation recognize the gentleman who I have circled in red there, literally standing at the right of Dr. Martin Luther King while he gives his I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington in 1963. He is a gay man, and he is the one who is credited with actually organizing the March on Washington, which many people believe would not have happened if it hadn't been for him. But because he was a gay man, he had to stay in the background. So I'm going to have to stop my thing here just for a second because I think it's on narrated timings. So give me just a moment.
So while you're doing that, was going to mention, Charlie, I think that website you were showing is a clinical group in Mercer Island. Actually, if you go to our center's website, LGBTQ search, will actually get you listings.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Barb.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try this again. So as I mentioned earlier.
So your slides are not showing yet.
Okay. Okay, are they showing now?
They are showing, but not full screen. And we're seeing a little gray box in. This is fun, isn't it?
Okay, so. How about now?
Looking good.
Okay. So until 1973, just the very fact that you were gay, you could be involuntarily committed and forced to undergo treatment to cure your homosexuality. You'll see this headline up here, 13 nabbed in crackdown on morals offenders here. If any of you who identify as women are wearing anything but a dress right now, you would have been one of the 13 morals offenders who were arrested. And not only were they arrested, their names, occupations, addresses, and family contact information were published in the Tampa News Tribune simply because they were, to all appearances, dressed like men. So they were wearing pants and sports coats and not dresses. So people could be and were arrested and involuntarily committed to psychiatric institutions. Some of the ways that they were treated to cure their homosexuality was electroshock therapy, castration, hysterectomies for lesbian and bisexual women. It was also a felony in all 50 states. I mentioned that until 2003, there were still 17 states where it was a felony to engage in same-sex behavior. And as I mentioned, this information was published in newspapers, so people stood to lose everything. And so this is just one of the reasons why people today might still be mistrustful of healthcare settings. So this is a short clip from a documentary called Cured.
Was electric.
There you go.
Okay, sorry about that. So many people mistakenly believe that in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted to change homosexuality from a sociopathic personality disturbance to a mental illness. Many people believe that at that point, homosexuality was no longer considered a mental illness, but that's actually not true. So it was changed from a sociopathic personality disturbance to sexual orientation disturbance in 1974, and then again in 1980, ego-dystonic homosexuality. And these two diagnoses, so being gay in and of itself was not considered a mental illness, but if you were distressed or experienced distress about your sexual orientation, then it was considered a mental illness. And it was not until 1980, and I'll get to that on the next slide. So in 1987, it was still, if you were distressed about your sexual orientation, was still considered a mental illness. And 1994 in the DSM-4, still considered a mental illness if you were distressed by your sexual orientation. Of course, it was pointed out that straight people are not distressed by being straight, so it's not that people's sexual orientation was distressing, it's how they were treated by society because of their sexual orientation. It was actually not until 2015 that homosexuality was removed as a psychiatric disorder from the DSM. Gender identity was not disentangled from the DSM until 1980, when there was a new classification called transsexualism. In 1994, that was replaced with gender identity disorder, and subsequent renditions of the DSM, the 4 text revised. It was the same thing in 2015 with the DSM-5. We're seeing the exact same thing with gender dysphoria now that we see with homosexuality in the past. So being transgender in and of itself is no longer considered a mental illness. But if you're distressed because your gender identity does not align with your biological sex, you are still by definition considered to have a mental illness. So even today, the medical healthcare providers, the American Psychiatric Association, still considers transgender gender dysphoria to still be a mental illness if you're distressed by your gender identity not matching your biology. So one thing I want to point out here, and this goes all the way back to the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, and we're actually seeing this today. This idea of homosexuality or gender dysphoria being a mental illness or being a perversion, it's always framed and always has been framed in terms of when someone think of the children. So I don't know if you've ever seen The Simpsons, but that actually became a trope, and it was actually based on Anita Bryant in 1976. So Dade County, Florida, was the first county in the United States to pass a gay civil rights ordinance. And Anita Bryant, who at the time was the spokesperson for the American Citrus Association, declared that we needed to protect our children. She knew that we needed to protect our children because she knew that gay people could not have children of their own. And so gay people were recruiting children into the quote homosexual lifestyle. We saw this with the moral majority in the late 70s throughout the 1980s. And we're actually seeing this again today. So some people will say, well, you know, that was then, but this is now. And I would respond, really? Because so far this year, 2023, the 21st century, lawmakers in more than 46 states have introduced more than 650 anti-LGBTQ plus bills, and they're still using this. They're not saying, won't someone think of the children? Then they're now using the nomenclature grooming. And so it was actually 1929 that New York State outlawed drag shows because they were afraid that people were going to be trying to convert children to that lifestyle. And here, just within this last year, we see this happening in states all over the country where people are outlawing drag shows simply because they are claiming that these drag queens are actually grooming children to become homosexuals or to become transgender or drag queens. So for those of you who identify as straight, let me ask you kind of a rhetorical question. Do you live your life as a straight cisgender person, or do you live your life as a person? One of the things that sexual and gender minority people have experienced throughout the course of our lives is that we are sexualized because of our sexual orientation or gender identity, whereas straight people have a sexual orientation and a gender identity, but they're not sexualized in the same way. So the reason that this is important is from a life course perspective. So back in the 1980s and 1990s, Glenn Elder was very interested in how where we are geophysically when historic events happen and the developmental stage that we're in determines how we experience that. So he was looking particularly at people who were living during the Great Depression. So both of my parents were born literally when the Great Depression was started. So they were born into the Great Depression and they grew up knowing the Great Depression. So their perspective of the Great Depression was very different from someone who was, say, 16 or 18 or 20 at the time when the Great Depression hit. And so their entire life courses got disrupted. So at that time, something like 25% unemployment. So people who would be typically getting ready to get married, start their own families may have not been able to because of the Great Depression. So let's talk a little bit about social determinants of health. And I'm pretty sure you all know that by definition, social determinants of health are differences in population level health, and it's based on physical, economic, and or social disparities. So it's not because a person is poor or because they're socially marginalized. I'm sorry, not because they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or racial ethnic minorities, but because of the way that systemic discrimination and marginalization affects people's health. So we typically think about, if we think about it in terms of an iceberg, we typically think of health as something you have or you don't have. And we typically tend to conceptualize it as people's individual choices, and we don't really think about social environments or support networks or culture or values or beliefs or assumptions or all of these things that are actually underlying or underneath the very tip of the iceberg that we call health, but they're all there and they're all part of health. And so all of these things are what these are the social determinants driving health disparities. So we all experience general stressors. So things like losses of a close relationship, serious illness, unrealistic workloads. But minority stress theory says that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and more recently transgender people, in addition to the general stressors that everyone experiences, also experience minority stressors. So these are on top of general stressors. So things like discrimination, victimization, these can be actual experiences of discrimination or victimization, or they can be chronic, like cultural gravity, going back to that, how how you experience the culture that you walk through on a day-to-day level. Sexual and gender minority people experience anticipated rejection, and this is in particular important to others, so employers, family members, close friends, things like that. So these become chronic stressors, and many people will hide their sexual orientation or gender identity as a short-term stopgap measure to make themselves less visible target for discrimination and victimization, which in the short term actually is helpful, but in the long term, having to hide an important part of who you are becomes another chronic stressor. And so this is because we all internalized the dominant stereotypes, attitudes, and beliefs about different social identity groups. So white people are like this, and Black people are like this, and women do this, and men do this. So we've all internalized that. And people who, like myself, have internalized heterosexism, we have come to believe that we are all these bad things that society and culture say that we are. So our research shows that all of these minority stressors are very significant contributors to the health disparities that older sexual and gender minorities experience. So I'm highlighting one of the 4 M's here, the mentation, and you'll see that I've actually underlined depression because that's one of the most powerful health disparities that we see. So where you see the distress depression 50%, so one of our population-based studies, we compared lesbian, gay, and bisexual, cisgender or non-transgender adults age 50 and older to their straight counterparts age 50 and older. And you can see here that the levels of clinically significant depressive symptomatology are 4 times greater among lesbian, gay, bisexual older adults than they are straight older adults. And again, it's because of those minority stressors, not because of their sexual orientation. And when we compare transgender older adults to non-transgender lesbian, gay older adults, you can see these disparities are even more striking. So almost half of transgender adults age 50 and older currently endorse clinically significant depressive symptomatology. Now, we cannot diagnose depression through a survey. It has to be done through a clinical interview, but the surveys that we use actually use the clinical criteria for depression. And then when we look at other chronic health conditions, so these health disparities are differences in both mental health outcomes as well as physical health outcomes. There is no singular cause of any of these things, but as you can see here, for the most part, in addition to mental distress or higher rates of depression, anxiety disorder, PTSD, things like that, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender and non-binary older adults experience significant disparities in chronic health conditions as well. And again, it's not because of sexual orientation or gender identity, it's because of how people are treated in society because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so this goes to one of the other 4 M's, which is the mobility. And so the thing about mobility is it doesn't account for structural factors. So we all have implicit biases. When I teach in a regular grounded classroom setting, so I do teach a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also advanced practice with older adults. And I often have students say, well, I'll just leave my biases outside of the clinical room. And I tell you, you can't do that unless you like detach your head. Because we're actually evolutionarily hardwired for biases. When we're on the Serengeti 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, where the threats in the environment were lions and tigers and bears, we needed to be able to recognize a potential threat without having to take the time to actually think about whether it was a threat or not. But today, the social environment has itself become a social threat to people who are socially marginalized. So whether it's race, ethnicity, women, so women who identify as women, regardless of whether cisgender or transgender, know exactly what it's like to experience sexism. So all of these things are happening, and most of the time we're not aware of it. And it's, I'm not going to say it's a good thing to have non-conscious bias, but it is a good thing to recognize that we have it, even if we don't think we have it. I've been working on this stuff for more than 20 years now, and I still recognize that I have implicit racist attitudes. I have implicit sexist attitudes. I'm not consciously sexist. I'm not consciously racist, but I've been socialized in terms of racism and sexism throughout my entire life. I'm better at recognizing it, but it's always going to be part of me. So here's a question for you to help you recognize that even if you think you don't have implicit biases, I'm asking here, how many Black, Indigenous, people of color, or sexual and gender minority rocket scientists can you name? And I'm using rocket scientists kind of loosely here to think more about kind of those higher levels of education. When I do this in a regular classroom setting, you know, how many famous Black people can you name? And it immediately goes to entertainers or to sports figures. But it really never goes to people like Sally Ride, who was the first lesbian to go into outer space, or Alan Hart, who was one of the first people to have a hysterectomy and transition from he was assigned biological female at birth, but identified as a man, and actually had a successful gender affirming transition. We all know Florence Nightingale, but how many of us know that she was a lesbian? How many of us know that Sir Francis Bacon, who's considered the father of the scientific method, was actually gay? How many of us know that Alan Turing, who all of our computer sciences, everything that we use with computers today, was actually arrested and was actually chemically castrated because he was gay? And today there's a Turing Nobel Prize. But we typically don't think of people like this when we think about famous people, because again, these implicit biases that we have. So I'm not saying here that the medical model is a bad thing. I fully recognize I would actually be dead if it were not for the medical model. But I'm also a big believer in a social model. So this is the social model of disability, but it also applies to any other aspect of human experience. So the medical model tends to think of people in terms of their diseases or their impairments. And the social model says it's actually the social environment that is marginalizing people. And they're actually both true at the same time. So the only reason I'm showing this slide is I invite you to Google IAT or the Harvard University Implicit Project Test. And they have an entire series of tests that you can take, and it won't tell you that you're racist or sexist or anything like that. It may tell you that you may have a moderate preference for younger people as opposed to older people, or white people as compared to Black people. I've actually taken these, and I'm not surprised that I actually have a slight preference for gay people as I do over straight people, simply because of the gay bashing and things that I've experienced over the course of my life. So these are some more of the health disparities that, so this is sexual gender minorities across the board. So one of the things that we consistently see is that sexual and gender minorities typically have significantly higher levels of education than their straight counterparts, but they also typically have lower levels of income pretty much across the board. We see higher rates of physical limitations, lifetime discrimination, victimization. Almost 2/3 of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender adults aged 50 and older have experienced discrimination or victimization over the course of their lives. And that discrimination and victimization is a significant predictor of health disparities. So these weakened immune systems, mental distress, higher rates of social isolation, physical limitations, and things like that. When we look, so this is specifically looking at sexual orientation. And so historically, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender has been clumped together under a singular umbrella, thinking that LGBTQ plus people are pretty homogenous when actually we're every bit as heterogeneous as heterosexuals. And so when we compare lesbian and bisexual women, non-transgender lesbian, bisexual women to straight cisgender women, we see that they have higher rates of disability, cardiovascular disease, things like that. We see different disparities when comparing gay and bisexual men to straight men. And then bisexual older adults actually experience stigma both in the dominant society as well as biphobia and bisexual stigma within LGBTQ plus communities. We also see similar things when we compare transgender older adults to lesbian, gay, bisexual older adults. So higher levels of obesity, lack of physical activity, poor physical health. So all of these different types of health disparities that they experience. And again, it's because of this structural discrimination and oppression. It's not because of their gender identity or their gender dysphoria. So I'm going to talk really quickly about the difference between equality and equity. Equality means that everyone gets the same amount of whatever it is we're talking about. And that assumes that the playing field is level. And if we really take a look, we know that the playing field is not level. One way to think about equality is if you sit down to a big holiday dinner with your family, everyone from your 2-month-old infant to your 90-year-old grandparents, your 16-year-old teenager, your 40-year-old spouse are all going to get the exact same amount of every type of food. That's what equality is. But equity recognizes that the playing field is not level. And so the idea is in equity is to recognize that some people experience barriers to equality. And so equity is about recognizing those barriers and addressing those barriers. So that's where we come to the health equity promotion model. So based on a lot of our research, we developed this specifically to promoting health equity. So the idea that everyone deserves the best health outcomes, the best healthcare access, the best health care that they can get. So typically when people come in to see us, they come in to see us either for physical health issues or for mental health issues. So this can be anything from HIV, obesity, cancer to health-related quality of life, suicidality, things like that. And when we're assessing people when they come in to see us for healthcare issues, we will typically ask some questions about their behaviors. So what is your exercise like? What is your diet like? Do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you use substances? Things like that. To a lesser degree, we'll ask about social and community supports, but we very rarely, if ever, talk about things like identity management strategies. And so that identity management is a more current term for what we used to call concealment or being in the closet or being out of the closet or being open about one's sexual orientation or gender identity. What we almost never look at are these multi-level contexts. So these current and historical structural levels of exclusion, institutional heterosexism, as well as interpersonal and intrapersonal discrimination, victimization, things like that. And we also don't look at that idea of intersectionality. And so intersectionality is important in terms of stress proliferation. So I experience heterosexism due to my sexual orientation, but I don't experience racism because I have white skin, and I don't experience sexism because I identify as a man. But a Black transgender woman is going to experience sexism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, racism, and all of these other things. So she's going to experience more types of discrimination and exclusion more frequently and to greater intensities. And a life course perspective says that all of this accumulates over the course of our lives. So we know from adverse childhood experiences that experiencing trauma when you were a child is going to accumulate over the lifetime. People who've experienced adverse childhood experiences are going to have poor mental and physical health outcomes even into older adulthood. So here I'm going to talk about how we can make a difference. And so I'm showing this roller stool here for a very specific reason. So microaggressions are those interpersonal and intrapersonal types of discrimination, marginalization, social exclusion. They're the everyday, commonplace slights, whether behavioral, environmental, or verbal, that somehow express hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes. So a few years ago, because I am an older person, I went in to have my very first skin cancer screening because I'm of that age. And the physician is on one of these stools and he's checking out my skin across my body. And I don't even remember how it came up, but I mentioned something about my husband. And literally the moment I said my husband, he wheeled his little stool across to the other side of the room and would not come close to me again. He probably didn't even recognize he was doing that, but I recognized instantly that he was uncomfortable with the fact that I was gay. So even these small, seemingly innocuous manifestations actually communicate a hostile or a negative attitude. And it's not the intention that's important, it's the impact. So if I have a loaded gun and I shoot you, it doesn't matter whether I intentionally did it or whether I accidentally did it. If you're shot, you're going to feel it and it's going to feel as bad. So it's important for us to recognize that what's important is not our intention, but the impact that we have in the things that we say and do with our clients. So I'm sure that those of you in the healthcare settings have probably experienced different types of microaggressions in terms of your providing healthcare services, regardless of whether it's based on your sex, based on your gender, based on your race, your ethnicity, your nativity, or any of these other social identity groups that people experience discrimination and marginalization as a result of. So what does this have to do with the 4 M's? So as you pointed out earlier, Barbara, and thank you again, we want to align our care with what the older adults specifically want in terms of their health outcomes, their goals, and their care preferences to treat these issues across the board. And so ensuring that older adults recognize that they are being recognized not just as older adults, but also as full members of the community is very important in promoting healthcare. So for those of you who don't recognize this image here, this is the AIDS memorial quilt. So if you look here, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, older adults, pretty much across the board, are significantly more likely to live alone. They're less likely to be married or partnered. I've already talked about more likely to experience discrimination and victimization. One of the unique types of discrimination or victimization that older sexual and gender minorities experience is the threat of being outed. Someone says, you know, I'm going to tell people that you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender if you don't do what I tell you to do. And particularly among older adults, so over half of people living with HIV/AIDS in the United States today are aged 50 and older, and many of them have lost significant others, best friends, things like that over the course of their lives. So they may be experiencing survivor's guilt on top of everything else. The reason I'm showing this cigarette image here is because there's pretty solid research that shows that being socially isolated and being lonely is as bad for your mental and physical health as smoking a pack of cigarettes every single day of your life. And so you can see here comparing sexual and gender minorities to heterosexual, non-cisgender, non-transgender, older adults pretty much across the board. Sexual and gender minority older adults are more likely to feel left out, isolated, and to lack companionship. Those who live alone are at the greatest risk, and every year that goes by, sexual and gender minority adults, 10% are more likely to live alone each year. And so just because you live alone doesn't mean you're socially isolated, but it does significantly increase the risk of social isolation. So loneliness, we know, predicts functional decline, premature mortality, accelerated biological aging, which are all risk factors for dementia. So remember that mentation. Socially isolated older adults are experience decreased social engagement, which also increases the risk for dementia. And they're also more likely to have difficulties with physical functioning and have unmet needs, which is going to significantly increase the risk of being institutionalized. So we have our basic research unit, which is the National Health Aging, Sexuality, Gender Study. We also have our intervention unit. So we're currently testing innovations in dementia empowerment in action. And this is intervention that is culturally responsive to sexual and gender minority older adults. But what we know is almost all dementia interventions are focused on care providers or recipient care provider dyads. Almost none are specific to people living with dementia just by themselves. And what we found out when we rolled out our first pilot test was half of sexual and gender minority adults aged 50 and older who wanted to participate in our IDEA study weren't able to because they didn't have an informal caregiver. So we're developing and doing some more pilot testing of ways to provide these types of IDEA interventions for sexual and gender minority older adults who don't have a caregiver. So this is just one more social exclusion that we're attempting to address with our research and our interventions. So remember that implicit by itself. So you can see here that, again, we tend to think about people's individual behaviors and we don't really think about institutional and structural forces that shape and influence people's behaviors. And so if we are engaging in microaggressions, if implicit bias is somehow impacting the healthcare that we're providing older adults based on sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, gender, or any of these other things, we're actually, in a very real sense, contributing to these health disparities. So these are two different ways to think about it. So you see change in loneliness over time in terms of day-to-day discrimination. So the more discrimination sexual and gender minority experience on a daily basis, the more likely they are to be lonely. And then on the other hand, the more they are engaged in communities, and here we're talking specifically about sexual and gender minority communities, you can see that their loneliness actually decreases over time. So by reducing day-to-day discrimination and increasing community engagement, we are actually intervening with these health disparities. So this is an 88-year-old participant in our study who talked about he's not aware anyone close to him knows or suspects his sexual orientation. So he's almost 90 years old and no one knows that he's a gay person. He goes on to say his son hinted about it once, but not in recent years. And at his death, they'll probably find telltale clues. So imagine what your life might be like if you're almost 90 years old and you've had to hide an important part of who you are over the course of your life, and hiding who you are is actually contributing to your loneliness, to your greater risk for chronic health conditions, greater risk for poor mental health outcomes, and things like that. This is another documentary, and I'm trying to keep myself on track for time here, so I'm not going to show this, but you can Google Gen Silent. So this documentary follows the lives of 6 lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender older adults in the greater Boston area over the course of their lives. And this is like a 4-minute trailer here. And you can see how even today, one of the older gentlemen talks about, you can just tell when they don't really want you there. And we actually can tell when people really don't want us there. So here's what we can do to create welcoming communities as healthcare providers. We can recognize, first of all, that beyond just a sense of security and belonging, that being part of a community is full membership in the community. So how we can be unwelcoming is we can not recognize that we have sexual and gender minority. I know in medical settings, we use patients. In mental health care settings, I typically use the word clients, but I'm using patients today. You can don't represent sexual and gender minority people in your workplace, and don't do outreach to people in the sexual and gender minority community. So what does this mean? So Kiara, who identifies as bisexual, is looking through the facility's brochures, and she's disappointed to see few people of color on the pamphlets, and all the couples are portrayed as heterosexuals. And I see this every place I go into for healthcare settings. And so when I look at, what do I see in the waiting room? What do I see in the lobby? Do I see myself represented? And typically, as a gay man, I don't see myself represented. And as a older person, I don't typically see myself represented. And so this is where I'm also calling out the LGBTQ community, because the LGBTQ plus community is very ageist, and almost the vast majority of resources are focused on younger sexual and gender minorities, which is important, but it's also important to recognize that older sexual and gender minorities exist also. So if I walk into your healthcare setting and I see any of this type of thing, that's going to tell me, at the very least, you recognize that I exist, and more importantly, that my sexual orientation is an important aspect of who I am. And so what you're communicating when you're showing an Alzheimer's Association or an AARP sticker that shows that pride comes in all ages, you're showing that you recognize some of your patients are going to be sexual and gender minorities. So it's important to use terms and language on forms that acknowledge the existence of your sexual and gender minority patients, especially in outreach materials, recognize family of choices and policies and procedures. So sexual and gender minorities are less likely to have children. Those that do have children are more likely to be estranged from them. So instead of asking, who's your mother, who's your father, ask, who do you consider to be your family? How do you identify in terms of gender? And it's important to educate yourself and other providers. There's a ton of books, movies, community events out there. So next month is National Pride Month. And so that's a great opportunity to educate yourself. If someone does come out to you, absolutely do not respond with neutrality or negativity, because they are trusting you with some information that they may not have shared with any other person in their life. And that is a singular honor and a sign of trust. They're telling you that they trust you enough to hold this information about themselves. So if someone does come out to you, recognize that that is an honor and a sign of trust. So I want to close today in recognizing that for all of the health disparities, for all of the challenges historically and ongoing that older sexual and gender minority adults experience, I feel the same way as the 70-year-old participant in our study. In spite of some of the hassles I've had in my life because I'm gay, I consider being gay a gift. It's made my life richer and opened so much of the world for me. If I had to do over again, there are some things I would do differently, but being gay is not one of those things. So here's a lot of the contact information. So we have our National Health Aging, Health and Wellness Research, our intervention research, our programs and trainings. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. There's my direct email address and phone number right there. And so feel free to reach out and contact us if you have any questions, if there's anything that we can do. I love to do trainings and things in the community like I'm doing today. And I believe that I just hit the 75-minute mark.
That was just really, really powerful and important. Thank you so much, Charlie. And I wanted to build on what you were just talking about, because Cindy is asking if you know of research on best practices for nursing homes and their LGBTQIA residents. And then Lisa stepped into the chat and said that the Goldsen Institute actually has some training for SNF workers, and that she thinks Jessica Soa is the contact for that, but you would know all that. So I'll put it to you.
So that's actually a great question. And actually I have taken over. So the program we have specifically for skilled nursing facilities called Safe Home. And it is mandated by Washington State that skilled nursing facilities have particular types of trainings. And we recognize that like all other healthcare providers, that skilled nursing facilities are short on staff, short on time. But we do have these trainings specific for skilled nursing facilities. It is called Safe Home. And if any of you today are actually part of skilled nursing facilities or part of the staff of skilled nursing facilities, if you'd reach out to me or Jessica Sawa, that would be great. We are trying to line up these trainings. You can also Google the Goldsen Institute. It's basically goldseninstitute.org. Every single one of our publications is freely available on that website. And again, we're more than happy to have a direct conversation with you about coming out to your agency to do trainings. We have 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour trainings, and we also do booster sessions after the initial trainings.
And somewhat related, do you want to mention the handbook that we put at the end of your slides? That's for everyone that is part of the handout with the slides is their resource guide.
Yes, so the Age Pride Center is our translational unit. So there's in-house, which is basic research, IDEA, which is our intervention research, and then Age Pride Center, which is our translational, where we actually take our basic science and intervention research and bring it back to the community to give back to the community. And so we developed this resource that I sent to you earlier, Barbara, that you're making available to people, and that's also available on our website. And this is a very useful resource both for healthcare providers as well as for sexual and gender minority older adults. And some of it is local, some of it's national, some of it's regional, the 5 Northwest WWAMI states. And so that's all there too. And so regardless of whether you're a provider, if you identify as a sexual gender minority adult, or if you're like me who identifies as a gay healthcare provider, then there's all kinds of really cool resources there for you.
Really, really helpful. And going back to your slide, the information you had about minority stressors, Lisa mentioned her spouse is transmasculine, and she would say that anticipated violence, in addition to anticipated rejection, is a major fear Any
Yes.
thoughts about that?
Yes, absolutely. So the original minority stress model was originally developed by Elon Meyer and was published in 2003. And that was specific to sexual orientation. So at that time, it did not extend to transgender or non-binary people. It has since been revised, but in that discrimination, so there are four primary minority stressors. So the most external is victimization and discrimination, and that can be actual experiences of discrimination or victimization, or like the person you're referring to right now, the actual anticipation of that. So whenever on a daily basis, I really have to stop reading the news because there is such a threat of violence against sexual and gender minority people. So even if you're not directly in the moment being threatened, that ambient chronic cultural gravity that you could be threatened at any moment is a very real, very pervasive, and actually as powerful as actual discrimination and victimization in terms of the impact it has on physical and mental health.
Um, and just to give you some feedback, one of the attendees said that this was really great. As an older gay man himself, I felt like someone else understands and knows the silent challenges of the disenfranchised.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And, you know, that's, to me, that's why it is so important whether or not I see myself represented in my social environment, regardless of whether it's the healthcare setting, at the bus stop, or what. If I don't see myself represented, then I'm being silenced. And we see that, uh, you know, with racial ethnic minorities, things like that. But again, we also see that ageism, both in the dominant culture as well as in sexual and gender minority communities, that as we get older, we become more invisible. So the place where we finally found home. So I was 17 years old when I was in San Francisco for my very first gay pride parade. I went to a high school with 3,000 to 4,000 students in it. And intellectually, I knew I couldn't be the only gay student in my high school, but I was the only one that I knew. When I was 17 and I went to that first gay pride parade in San Francisco, I was surrounded by 250,000, a quarter of a million people just like me for the first time in my life. Now that I've gotten older, as an older gay man, that very same community is now marginalizing me just because I am older. So thank you for sharing that.
Cindy says she's a social work professor emeritus at the University of Montana. Really appreciates all the information you packed into this time. Both students and practicing professionals need this information and self-awareness. That actually brings up something about you do a lot of trainings. How are you able to sort of integrate some of this into courses beyond social work here at the university?
Given the opportunity, absolutely, because this is applicable across the board. A couple of years ago, I was actually asked to talk about this in a STEM setting, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So they were recognizing the heterosexism and the cisgenderism and the hard sciences. And so I had a brief opportunity at that point to be able to integrate some of this into science, technology, engineering, and math courses. So this is actually applicable to any type of educational milieu out there. And I'm happy to do that.
Okay, any other questions? Let's see. Just more information about how all of this is, helpful. And I would encourage you folks to pull down the handout, because the slides, which are very informative, are there along with the resource guide that he mentioned. So
And again, if
it's
you
a
go to
great
the
resource.
it's basically Goldsen with an E, Goldsen.org or GoldsenInstitute.org. Every single one of our publications is freely available on our website. And so these are research going back over a decade now. We have one that we developed called Creating a Vision for the Future. And what we did was that one I think we published in 2013, but we took the Council on Social Work Education competencies that were in effect at that time. And we said, okay, what would each of these competencies look like if we were to apply it specifically to older sexual and gender minority adults? And so we identified 10 competencies. And for each of those competencies, there's a specific strategy that you can use to enact that competency. So that's also freely available on our website, along with all of these other resources.
And the link for that is on the last page of the slides handout, but I'm going to try and post it in here also for folks. There, I think that's got it.
Yes.
So the link for the evaluation survey is also on there, and I don't see any other questions at this point. So unless there are, I'll wait for just a second. Charlie, this was just so helpful and valuable resource, and I hope that those of you attending will refer others to the presentation. Those who are working with older adults, those who are older LGBTQ older adults, I think would gain some real affirmation from it as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again, everyone, for being here today. Thank you again, Barbara, for inviting me to share this today. I think it's so incredibly important. So thank you to everyone involved.
All right. We'll see you next week, everyone. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Okay, bye-bye.